A country that built its identity on never fighting again is now preparing for war. Japan has approved a defense budget of $58 billion, the largest in its history. Within months, military spending will reach 2% of gross domestic product, placing Japan behind only the United States and China in total defense outlays. This is not a routine adjustment. It is a structural break from everything that defined Japan's post-war role in the world. Only a few years ago, such a shift would have been politically unthinkable. Japan is the nation that wrote pacifism directly into its constitution after the Second World War. The same country that pledged never to maintain offensive military forces. For decades, its self-defense forces existed under tight legal limits, framed carefully as defensive and restrained. That framework is now being reworked in real time. The change goes beyond budgets and procurement. A senior Japanese official recently said something that had long been considered untouchable, that Japan should consider possessing nuclear weapons, not as an academic exercise, not as a distant hypothetical, as a serious policy discussion. The statement sent shockwaves across Asia and raised immediate alarms globally because of what it represents when the only nation ever struck by atomic bombs begins openly reassessing nuclear deterrence. This did not happen overnight. Japan's security environment has deteriorated rapidly. China has expanded its military presence across the East China Sea and beyond. North Korea continues launching ballistic missiles, some passing directly over Japanese territory. Russia has increased military activity in the northern Pacific. The strategic buffer that once allowed restraint has steadily eroded. So what changed? What threat is so immediate, so overwhelming, that it could unravel nearly 8 decades of pacifist doctrine in less than half a decade? And the question now dominating defense circles: could Japan actually cross the nuclear threshold? And if it does, what happens to the balance of power in Asia? To understand how extraordinary this moment is, you have to return to the foundation. In 1947, under United States occupation after the Second World War, Japan adopted Article 9 of its constitution, one of the most sweeping pacifist commitments ever written into law. Japan formally renounced war as a sovereign right and pledged that land, sea, and air forces would never be maintained. 2 decades later, in 1967, Prime Minister Eisaku Sato introduced the 3 non-nuclear principles. Japan would not possess nuclear weapons, it would not produce them, and it would not allow them on its territory. These were not symbolic positions. They became the core of Japan's post-war identity. And today, that identity is under more pressure than at any point since it was created. For nearly 60 years, Japan relied on the US nuclear umbrella and kept its military, officially called the Self-Defense Forces, strictly defensive. No offensive weapons, no power projection, no strikes on foreign soil. Even the word military was avoided. Japan became the world's pacifist poster child, a nation that turned its back on war. But here's where it gets interesting. Between 2022 and 2026, Japan did something no one thought possible. It announced a 5-year plan to double defense spending to 2% of GDP, acquire long-range strike weapons capable of hitting targets over 1,000 miles away, and deploy American Tomahawk cruise missiles on its destroyers. By March 2026, Japan will officially become the 3rd largest military spender on the planet, outpacing every country except the US and China. And in December 2025, a senior official told reporters Japan should have nuclear weapons. So, the central question driving this video is clear. What threat is so severe that Japan is willing to abandon 80 years of pacifism? And could it actually build nuclear weapons? Japan's defense ministry doesn't mince words. In its 2025 white paper, it states Japan faces the most severe and complex security environment in 80 years. That's not hyperbole. 3 threats are converging simultaneously, and each one alone would justify a defense rethink. First, China. Beijing has conducted the largest peacetime military buildup in modern history, and much of it is aimed at the Indo-Pacific. In June 2025, 2 Chinese aircraft carriers were spotted near the Japanese island of Iwima, the first time Chinese carriers had come that close. In December 2025, Chinese jets engaged their weapons radar systems on Japanese aircraft during drills near southwestern Japan. That's called radar locking. It's one step away from firing. China explicitly names Taiwan as territory it will take by force if necessary, and in November 2025, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi said publicly that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be an existential crisis for Japan. Beijing's response was immediate and furious. Second, North Korea. In January 2026, Pyongyang launched multiple ballistic missiles toward the Sea of Japan, marking yet another violation of UN resolutions. Japan's defense minister called the tests a grave security threat directly affecting the safety of the Japanese people. North Korea has conducted dozens of missile tests over Japanese territory in recent years, and leader Kim Jong-un has ordered a sharp increase in missile production. Third, Russia. Moscow's increasing military cooperation with China and North Korea has created a three-front threat Japan has never faced before. But here's the kicker. Japan's alliance with the United States, the cornerstone of its security for 80 years, suddenly looks shakier than ever. Doubts about America's willingness to defend Taiwan, and by extension Japan, have forced Tokyo to ask a terrifying question: what if we're on our own? Japan's response has been swift and unprecedented. Between 2022 and 2026, Tokyo launched a 5-year defense buildup program designed to fundamentally transform the self-defense forces from a defensive shield into a strike-capable military. The 2026 defense budget allocates $6.2 billion for standoff missile weapons, designed to hit targets from long range without putting Japanese forces in danger. This includes $1.13 billion for upgraded Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles with a range of 620 miles. That's enough to strike targets deep inside China or North Korea from Japanese territory. Japan is also purchasing 400 American Tomahawk cruise missiles for $2.35 billion, with ranges exceeding 1,000 miles. These will be deployed on Japanese destroyers starting in 2026. For a country that constitutionally renounced offensive weapons, this is a seismic shift, but it doesn't stop there. Japan is spending $640 million on massive unmanned air, sea, surface, and underwater drones to defend its southwestern islands, the ones closest to Taiwan and China. It's building integrated air and missile defense systems, expanding its space and cyber capabilities, and stockpiling munitions at levels not seen since World War II. This isn't just about hardware. Japan's 2022 National Security Strategy explicitly names China as the greatest strategic challenge to regional peace, language that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Tokyo is also revising its security and defense policies by December 2026 to further consolidate military strength. Japan has crossed a doctrinal line. It now accepts that deterrence requires the ability to strike first if an attack is imminent. Here's what they did next that shocked even longtime allies. Japan established a new office inside the Defense Ministry, dedicated exclusively to analyzing Chinese military operations, equipment, and strategy. And in August 2025, Australia selected Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to build 11 new Mogami-class frigates for the Royal Australian Navy, the first time Japan has exported major combat systems in the post-war era. Tokyo is no longer just defending itself, it's becoming a regional military power broker. Here's the part that kept planners up at night. In December 2025, a senior government official advising Prime Minister Takaichi on security said publicly that Japan should have nuclear weapons. The comments sparked immediate outrage. Opposition parties demanded the official's dismissal, but the Prime Minister refused. Why? Because legally, Japan can build nuclear weapons. Article 9 doesn't explicitly ban them. In 1965, Japan's Cabinet Legislation Bureau determined that nuclear weapons would not violate Article 9 as long as they met the minimum necessary standard for self-defense. A constitutional scholar interviewed in 2026 stated that foreign commentators often assume that Article 9 bans nuclear weapons. It doesn't. We've resolved not to own any simply as a matter of national policy. That policy is the 3 non-nuclear principles announced in 1967. But here's the problem. Those principles are not the law. They were never written into the Constitution. They exist as a political commitment, one that any government could technically reverse. Prime Minister Takaichi has notably refused to explicitly reaffirm all 3 principles, and she has previously called for reviewing the principle against allowing nuclear weapons into Japan. The debate has gone mainstream. In April 2025, an Asahi Shimbun poll showed 73% of Japanese citizens supported joining the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, a sign that public opinion strongly favors nuclear disarmament. But a separate poll in January 2026 showed 60% of voters opposed Japan obtaining nuclear weapons. The split reflects a nation wrestling with its identity. One lawmaker from Hiroshima, the city destroyed by an atomic bomb in 1945, stressed in a parliamentary meeting that the 3 non-nuclear principles should be upheld. But there's one problem nobody's talking about. Even if Japan wanted nuclear weapons, would the United States allow it? Historically, the CIA has quashed the nuclear ambitions of non-European allies. South Korea's nuclear program was shut down in the 1970s, and Japan would face similar pressure. Yet, the debate continues. A ruling party lawmaker recently argued that open debate on nuclear weapons is essential to safeguarding the Japanese people. The genie is out of the bottle. If Japan goes nuclear, the entire Indo-Pacific ignites. South Korea would almost certainly follow. Taiwan might pursue its own program. Even nations in Central and Southeast Asia could reconsider their non-nuclear status. China has already responded with fury to the mere suggestion. Beijing's state media accused Japan of resurgent militarism and strategic adventurism, cloaked in the language of self-defense. By linking the Taiwan question to its own security, Japan crossed a red line that risks destabilizing the entire Asia-Pacific region, according to Chinese analysts. But here's where everything changed. Japan's leadership has made a calculated bet. The threat from China and North Korea is real, immediate, and existential. If Taiwan falls, Japan loses access to critical sea lanes, faces Chinese military bases 100 miles from its southern islands, and becomes vulnerable to blockade and coercion. One American analyst put it bluntly: Xi Jinping would have to preemptively attack Japan if he wanted a successful, full-scale invasion of Taiwan. Japan knows this, and it's preparing for that scenario. Tokyo is now coordinating defense policy more closely with the United States than at any time since the Cold War. The US-Japan alliance remains the cornerstone of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, according to Japan's defense minister. But Japan is also hedging. It's building capabilities that allow it to defend itself without full American support. The message to Beijing is clear. An attack on Taiwan means war with Japan. The question now isn't whether Japan will continue its military buildup. It is already locked into multi-year defense plans, signed procurement contracts, and a new national security strategy that all assume higher spending and more capable forces well into the next decade. The real uncertainty is how far that trajectory will extend and whether Japan will eventually cross its own long-standing red line by treating nuclear weapons as a realistic option rather than an unthinkable taboo. So, why did Japan break 80 years of peace policy and start debating nuclear weapons? From Tokyo's perspective, the country now sits in the middle of a tightening triangle formed by China, North Korea, and Russia, each fielding more advanced missiles, aircraft, and naval forces that can reach Japanese territory with little warning. That three-front pressure is something post-war Japan has never experienced at this scale, and it has pushed leaders to accept capabilities like long-range missiles and preemptive strike doctrines that would have been politically impossible a decade ago. At the same time, repeated questions in Washington about alliance burdens and priorities have created deep doubts about how automatic American protection would be in a worst-case scenario, forcing Japanese planners to imagine crises where they must hold the line largely on their own. Article 9 never truly banned nuclear weapons in a strict legal sense. What it did together with the three non-nuclear principles, was build a powerful social and political stigma that made nuclear armament untouchable in mainstream debate. That informal shield is now under strain, as more officials and commentators argue that Japan at least needs to study nuclear options. The old consensus is starting to fracture under the weight of missile tests over Japanese territory, Chinese pressure around Taiwan, and open discussion of great power war in the Indo-Pacific. Here is what you need to remember. First, Japan has already moved from being a restrained self-defense power to becoming the world's third largest defense spender, and by the middle of this decade, it plans to field offensive strike weapons designed to hit distant targets, a shift compressed into roughly 4 years of policy change and budgeting. Second, the nuclear question has migrated from the margins into the center of political life. It is now discussed in parliamentary committees, debated in major media, and weighed by advisors close to the Prime Minister, which means it can no longer be dismissed as fringe rhetoric. Third, any Japanese move toward nuclear weapons would almost certainly trigger cascading reactions in other capitals. South Korea, Taiwan, and possibly additional Asian states would reassess their own posture, setting off an arms race more intense than anything the region has seen since the middle of the 20th century. The question now isn't whether Japan will continue militarizing, because that path is already chosen. The deeper strategic unknown is whether China will try to exploit the narrow window before Japan's expanded deterrent and new strike capabilities are fully in place, especially in a crisis over Taiwan or contested islands. If Beijing moves early, the region could be dragged into conflict before those new forces can stabilize the balance. If it holds back, East Asia may enter a long, tense standoff shaped by rising Japanese power and a live nuclear debate. In both cases, the clock is ticking, and decisions made in the next few years will shape whether the Indo-Pacific settles into an uneasy deterrence or slides toward open war. If you found value in this discussion, please like, share with your peers, and subscribe for continued insights into emerging technologies.